So this is part 3 of our analysis in sheets of some fire death data. So we made a pivot table mainly to kind of assess the situation. Now let's work on the analysis. And one of the remaining things we kind of figured out is we're missing a few things here, right? If we want to tally up how many occurred each year or how many occurred each winter, we need some new columns in here that will give us that information. So thankfully, dates are really easy to work with in any spreadsheet program, really any database program. We can strip pieces of this, as long as this is stored as an actual date, and you could see here that it's flush right, that's a good indicator, and it is, in a typical date format. If you see something, do you see how these names are flush left? That's an indicator that's being stored as text. The age is flush right. Again, that's being stored as numeric. So dates and ages would be on the right, and that's a good way to know. It's important to know that spreadsheet programs store dates actually as numbers. The number of days that have elapsed since, I think it's like January 1, 1900 or something like that. So the actual, this is actually a number as far as the sheets is concerned, but it's just being displayed to us as a date. So if we want to make this, make a new column that just has the year out of here, we're going to go over here to the right and create a new column. Make sure you label it, call it year, and we're going to do a formula. And every formula, or actually we're going to use a function, but every formula or function in Excel, when you're working in the cell, these individual cells, you start with an equal sign. In this case, we're going to say the word year, open parenthesis, and then it wants the cell address of the date. In this that we're going to transform. So the cell address of the date on this row that we're on is A2, and then you close the parentheses, and you'll notice it's giving us a little hint that the answer is going to be 2005. Yep, that is the answer we want. Say enter, and it might give you the autofill. If you're a beginner, I'm going to say reject the suggestion. So now how do we get this to go down the rest of the sheet? That's where the beauty of a spreadsheet is that we can copy this formula down to the rest of the rows, and it will know that you want, now instead of A2, you want to go to A3, A4, A5, etc. It'll adjust the function as you go. So to copy your formula down, notice your cursor, if you hover it around in different places around this blue box. I should point out, I'll put my cursor back on my answer. Hover around, you have a hand, you have an arrow, and then when you get to the lower right corner where that big dot is, you get a thin black cross. The thin cross is the copy tool. So what you do is you get over there, get the copy tool to show, push down the left mouse button, hold it down, and drag down. And if your data set is not too long, you can drag all the way to the bottom. If your data set is really long, you can double click on that dot and it will autofill to the bottom of the page it'll autofill until it finds a blank in the column immediately to the left of it. So you do run the danger that it could stop before it gets to the bottom of your data set. So you do always want to make sure that you always get to the bottom of your data set. Now, a couple of things about kind of just navigating around. You can use Control Shift or Command Shift on a Mac and your up arrows to go up and down a column. So I'm just holding Control and Shift on my keyboard and pushing the up and down arrows to kind of go up and down. The same would work going across, Control Shift across, and using the across arrows would allow you to highlight and highlight. So hold down Control and Shift on a Windows machine, hold down Command Shift on a Mac. Alright, so we've got our year. So now, but you can take a guess of how month is going to work, right? Equal sign, month, open parenthesis, A2, and it's going to give us the number 2, which in this case would be February, right? So I'm going to not do the autofills, put my cursor back on, get my copy tool, double click, and then I need to Control Shift down arrow to make sure it went all the way to the bottom. And then I can do Control Shift up arrow to make sure it went to the top. So now we do have this year, and we can do a pivot table on that year, so we can say how many occurred each calendar year. So let's do an insert pivot table, create, and we'll do that year in the rows, and then we could also put the year in the values. Now look what happened though. What is wrong here? Take a minute to think about what is wrong here. What it's doing is it's summarizing that because that year column is numeric, it's automatically guessing that you wanted to add all the values in that column, and it chose sum instead of that count A. So we're going to put it back on count A, and now we have the number of people who died each year. Notice 2018 is here, but remember that's an incomplete year. It only goes through March. So this is, this is just calendar years. Oh, interesting that we have the same number each of those 2 years. Very interesting. So here I'm going to rename this pivot table totals by year. Okay, so now we need to figure out what to do about the winter, right? Like what season, we want to know what season it is. So we can do that, with a little ingenuity here. So in Minnesota, winter is really November, December, January, February, March. So those are the months that I would call winter. So we need a way to be able to fill in this column to say winter, spring, summer, fall, depending on which month it is. So this is where we can use something called VLOOKUP to apply that. So if you go to your sheets at the bottom, I gave you a sheet called Season Lookup. And what I did is I have each of the month numbers over here, and then I assigned which season it is, at least here in Minnesota. If you live somewhere else, maybe you want to change yours a little bit. And we're going to use the VLOOKUP function to transfer this information back to our data set based on which month it is. And what's going to happen is the formula is going to look at the month for that row. It's going to look at this row here, for example. It's going to say, oh, that's 2. And it's going to look in this lookup and say, well, where is 2? Oh, here's 2. That means you want winter, and it'll transfer winter back. To make this a little easier, we're going to do a step first. That is, if you look up directions for VLOOKUP, you're probably not going to find this step, but it's going to make it a lot easier. What we're going to do is define this area as a range so that we can refer to this range without having to use cell addresses in our function, our VLOOKUP function. So what you do is you highlight this and right mouse click, and in this big long list down at the bottom is View More Cell Actions, and then Define Named Range. Define Named Range. And it brings up over here, and it looks like I've already created one. I created one called Seasons on this same range, but yours probably won't have this here. It won't be here. But I can call this, I'm just going to call mine Seasons 2. So you can call it whatever you want. But what it's going to do is it's going to take this range of cells, A4 to B15, in this particular sheet, and it's going to have a nickname assigned to it, essentially. Seasons 2 is what I've done. So I'm going to say done. So now if we go back to our main data, I'm going to X out of this named ranges with the X. Over here on the season, I can say, we can do the VLOOKUP. And this is something that you're going to need a tip sheet for. It's not something easy to memorize, although it gives you these great hints. So search key means what do you want to look up? And in this case, we want to look up that number 2 in the J column. So we're going to say cell J2 is what we're going to look up. And then what is the range where you want to look this up? That's where that little nickname comes in play. So there's my seasons 2. I hit tab to select it. Or you can just type the name of it as it is. And then index means which column in that range do we want to bring back. And so remember we had column 1, we had 2 columns. 1 was the month number and 2 was the season, winter, spring, fall. So you literally just put the number 2 in here. You don't put the column A, column B, column C or any of that. You just put which number it is. And then the final step is, do we need this? This is a little confusing. Is this an exact match or an inexact match? And you put the word false for an exact match, where you want 2 to match to 2, 3 to match to 3. I'm going to show you an inexact match in a little bit, but for now we're going to just put the word false in there. And notice it's already giving us winter as our hint, so that's good. Hit enter. And again, we're going to copy down our formula and make sure it went to the bottom. So now we have the seasons applied. So now if we want to add up like which season it is, the next thing we need to figure out is we need to kind of assign, well, we already know winter 2004-05 we're missing 04, so it's going to be tricky, but these ones that occurred in 05-06, for example, right here, we want these to be winter, we want some kind of label that's like 05-06 or something like that. And because the way we have this now, it's not going to work quite right. Although let's do a pivot table. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to do insert a pivot table. And I'm going to say I want the year in the rows and I want the season in the rows, both of them. And so you'll see we've got multiple winters on multiple years. And so that what's going to happen is, if I put values, we're going to count these people here in this winter are actually the January 06, January, February, March of 06 plus November and December of 06. It's lumping them together in ways we don't want, because remember the winter is crossing over a calendar year, so we need another step. So I'm gonna delete this sheet because we're gonna go back and do something different. So we need something that says 05, 06, etc. So a lot of this kind of figuring stuff out in spreadsheets is about looking for patterns. Like, how can we lean on patterns to avoid having to type things by hand? Like, you could very easily, this is not a huge data set, you could go in and literally assign all these winters to the correct kind of season that it's in. That these are 04-05 winter, and that these down here are the 05-06 winter, right? You could do that, but we could also do some pattern matching. So for example, anytime it's month 1, 2, or 3, I want that year to be the 04, the winters, like the starting year would be a year less than this. So, and if it's not 1, 2, or 3, then this year column is the correct start year. So let's say I want to do like kind of a start year. So ultimately I want to end up with something that's like 2004-05, right? That's kind of how I want to label this column. But right now I just have 05, and I only want to do this for the winter ones. So I kind of need the correct start year. So the start year for this one is going to be 04, but when I get down here to November, the start year is going to be 05. So it's kind of like, how do I make sure I get the right start year here? And that's where an if statement can come into play. So we could do something like this where we say if the month J2 is less than 4, so 1, 2, or 3, then we could do that year we have in the I column minus 1, and that's going to give us 04. If it's not 1, 2, or 3, less than 4, we can say just grab that year, I2. So an if statement, you give it something to evaluate, what's known as the logical expression, and then you give it what value if that is true, and then you give it what value if that is false. So what this did is it said, is J2 less than 4? And yep, it is. So it took what the value in I2, the year, and subtracted 1 and gave us 2004. Now if we copy this down, we can come down here to the winter of 05-06, and you'll see that it has, what it did is said, okay, J37, is that less than 4? And it said, nope, it is not. So then it jumped ahead and said, okay, we're just going to grab the value out of I37 and put that there. So of course we want to make sure everything went to the bottom. I did Control Shift down arrow, Control Shift up arrow. So now if I want to make this the wraparound year or whatever, I'm going to call this season year. We'll do we can do some concatenating. So we can say L2 ampersand, and then I'm going to do quote dash quote ampersand I2. Actually, we could be a little more specific. We could say we could just leave it start year. We don't need to do it. So now that if we do it this way, we have the start year and the season. Notice that, okay, so we already know these 2004 ones are going to be junk because we don't have a whole winter there. We really can't use them. But when we get down here to the winter of 05-06, notice that all of these winter ones from November of 05 to March of 06 are all labeled as 05. So we know that they are all the same winter. And now the computer will know that they are all the same winter, and we can treat them the same. So we can go back to that pivot table we wanted to do, insert a new pivot table, and we can put the start year in the rows. We can use season in the filters and say we only want the winters. Only the winters. Say OK. And then we can have it count. And you can use pretty much anything for the counting. I'll just use start year as the values, and we just need to make sure to change it to count A, to count the rows. So here's how many people died each winter by the season. And you could see that season, when I was doing the story, we were at 28, which was slightly higher than the previous few years, but definitely not the worst winter. But it was still among the worst. It's not a shocking revelation here, but it did kind of answer that burning question people had about, oh my gosh, it seems like a lot of people died this winter compared to previous winters. And that is holding true here. So I'm going to say deaths each winter. And here's my pivot table for that. Let's do one more thing before we call it a day here. Actually, I'm going to save this for another video so these don't get too long. Okay, we're going to have a part 4.